nobody sees it happening. That is what makes it so devastating and so complete. From the outside, the empath looks the same. Still showing up, still caring, still extending the same warmth, the same patience, the same extraordinary capacity for understanding that has always defined how they move through the world. The people in their life see no alarm, no visible deterioration, nothing that signals that something fundamental is shifting beneath the surface. But beneath the surface, in the deep, largely invisible interior of someone who has been hurt one too many times by people who should have known better, a transformation is already underway. Quiet, methodical, irreversible in the specific way that only the changes that happen below conscious awareness can be. The empath who has been hurt repeatedly does not break the way most people break. They do not shatter visibly. They do not erupt. They transform. And the transformation, driven by the dark psychology of repeated emotional injury meeting, extraordinary sensitivity produces something that the people who hurt them never anticipated and can never fully undo. This video is about that transformation, what it looks like from the inside. What is happening neurologically, psychologically, and emotionally in a person whose capacity to feel everything is being systematically subjected to pain that most people would have walked away from long before the empath considered it. What dark psychology reveals about where this process leads, and why the person who emerges on the other side is someone fundamentally, permanently different from the one who entered. If you are an empath who has been hurt repeatedly, this is the explanation for what has been happening inside you that you may not have had the language for. And if you love an empath who has changed in ways you cannot fully explain, this is the truth about what you were part of creating. The first thing that happens internally, and it happens so gradually that the empath rarely notices it in real time, is what psychologists call hypervigilance. In the empath, it takes a form that is qualitatively different from the hypervigilance that develops in response to physical threat. It is emotional hypervigilance, a heightened to perpetually active scanning of the social and relational environment for the specific signals that preceded previous pain. The empath's nervous system, already extraordinarily sensitive to emotional information by baseline, has now been trained by repeated injury to treat certain patterns as threats, a particular tone of voice, a specific kind of silence after a question, the almost imperceptible shift in someone's body language that signals a mood change the other person has not yet acknowledged. These signals were always visible to the empath. They were always part of the rich, detailed emotional landscape that the empath navigated naturally. But before the repeated hurt, they were simply information, data points in an environment the empath moved through with relative openness and trust. After the repeated hurt, they become warnings, and the brain operating from its most fundamental survival programming responds to warnings by mobilizing, by preparing, by shifting from the open, receptive, generously available state, that is, the empath's natural home, into a state of readiness that has no name in most emotional vocabularies, but that the empath can feel in their body as a constant, low-grade tension, a vigilance that does not turn off even in moments that should feel safe. Carl Jung wrote that the psyche does not distinguish between imagined threats and real ones, only between unprocessed experiences and integrated ones. The empath's hypervigilance is not irrational. It is the nervous system doing exactly what it was designed to do, protecting its host from the repetition of documented pain. The problem is that a nervous system in a state of permanent alert cannot simultaneously remain in the open, trusting, fully present state that the empath's deepest gifts require to function. And so the first casualty of repeated hurt is not the empath's capacity to feel. It is their capacity to feel safely, to extend their extraordinary sensitivity without the defensive overlay the repeated injury has installed. This is invisible to almost everyone around them, and it costs the empath more than anyone will ever know. The second internal transformation is one that the empath themselves often experiences as a moral failure, a betrayal of their own deepest values before they understand it for what it actually is. They begin to close, not dramatically, not in the visible, declarative way of someone who has decided they are done with people, quietly, incrementally, in the specific, targeted way of someone whose openness has been used against them enough times that the nervous system has begun to associate openness itself with danger. The empath starts leaving things unsaid that would previously have been expressed freely, starts holding back the spontaneous warmth that was once their most natural mode of engagement, starts managing the depth of their investment, consciously or not, to keep it slightly below the level that would make a repetition of previous hurt truly catastrophic. They are building internal walls, not the crude, obvious walls of someone who has declared themselves closed, but the sophisticated, almost invisible internal architecture of someone who has learned through repeated painful experience that not everything they feel should be expressed, not everyone they love should be given full access, and not every situation that appears safe actually is. Machiavelli understood this dimension of human change with his characteristic precision. He wrote that the man who has been repeatedly betrayed cannot return to the state of trust that preceded the betrayal, not because he has become inferior, but because he has become more accurate. His model of the world has been updated by evidence, and a more accurate model, while it protects him, also forecloses certain experiences that were only possible from inside the less accurate one. The closing of the empath is both a loss and an evolution. Honoring both dimensions of that truth is essential to understanding what repeated hurt actually does to the deepest feelers among us. Now, something far more complex begins to emerge, and it is something that the people who hurt the empath would find almost impossible to believe if it were described to them. The empath begins to see people with terrifying clarity, not the selective clarity of someone who has become cynical. The blanket, self-protective assumption that people are generally untrustworthy and should be treated accordingly. Something far more precise, far more uncomfortable for the people being seen. The repeated experience of being hurt, of having trusted a perception of someone that turned out to be inaccurate, of having invested in a version of a person that proved to be a performance, has done something to the empath's already extraordinary perceptual capacity. It has calibrated it, sharpened it, directed it specifically toward the gap between what people present and what they actually are. The empath, who's been hurt enough times, can now see this gap with an accuracy that is almost supernatural. They notice the micro-expression that contradicts the stated emotion. They feel the difference between genuine warmth and performed warmth, not as a suspicion, but as a certainty that arrives before thought. They know within moments of an interaction whether the person across from them is being real, and they know it with the confidence that their pre-hurt self, still trusting the surface presentation, never had access to. Jung wrote about the danger of too much consciousness, the specific suffering of the person who has become aware of dynamics and truths that most people around them have no access to and no desire for. The empath who has been hurt enough to develop this level of perceptual clarity is living this danger daily. They see what others cannot, and seeing what others cannot is a gift that comes at the cost of full membership in the world those others inhabit. Here is where the transformation takes a turn that surprises even the empath themselves, because it contradicts everything they believed about who they were. They begin to develop a darkness, not cruelty, not malice, not the deliberate desire to harm that they would have found incomprehensible in their pre-hurt state, something subtler and, in its own way, more powerful. A psychological iji, an understanding of how pain works, how it is inflicted, how it lands, what it does to a person, that only comes from having been on the receiving end of enough of it to study its mechanics from the inside. The empath who has been hurt repeatedly has been given, through no choice of their own, an education in the psychology of pain that most people never receive. They know, with the specificity of someone who has felt it, exactly where emotional wounds land deepest, exactly which words carry the most weight, exactly what withdrawal costs a person who has invested deeply, exactly how the removal of warmth from someone who has come to depend on it creates a cold they cannot locate the source of. They know all of this because it was done to them, and now they carry that knowledge, whether they want to or not. Most empaths do not weaponize this knowledge. Their values, their fundamental orientation toward care and toward the reduction of suffering in the world, prevent them from deploying what they know in the way that it could be deployed. But the knowledge is there, and it changes something about how they move through the world, creates a depth, a gravitas, a quality of presence that feels different from the open warmth they projected before. Machiavelli would recognize this as the acquisition of vortok through suffering, the specific, unchosen education in human nature that only genuine adversity can provide. And he would note that the person who possesses this knowledge, who has been educated by pain into a precise understanding of how human beings hurt and are hurt, is a person whose power, if they choose to use it with wisdom, is formidable in ways that comfort and ease can never produce. The sixth transformation, and perhaps the most privately painful of all, is what happens to the empath's relationship with hope. They do not lose it. They transform it into something almost unrecognizable. The empath before the repeated hurt loved with what can only be described as structural optimism, a deep, functional belief that people were capable of being better than their worst moments, that the right amount of patience, the right quality of love, the right sustained presence could call forth the best version of someone who was currently showing something much less than that. But repeated hurt has now also given them evidence on the other side. Evidence that patience, extended beyond what reason supports, does not always produce growth. Sometimes it produces exploitation, that presence given to the wrong person in the wrong dynamic does not always call forth the best. Sometimes it enables the worst. That investment of extraordinary care in a situation that was never going to honor it does not eventually produce the return it deserved. It's simply the transformation of hope in the repeatedly hurt empath is this. It becomes conditional. It does not disappear. The empath's orientation toward the potential in people is too fundamental to their nature to be extinguished by even repeated disappointment. But it is no longer extended as a default. It is now held in reserve, offered not to everyone who appears to need it, but only to situations and people who have demonstrated through behavior, through consistency, through the small and unremarkable daily evidence of their actual character, that the hope is grounded in something real. This is not pessimism. It is the evolution from structural optimism to evidence-based hope. And while it is less beautiful in its openness, less recklessly generous, less willing to believe against the available evidence, it is more durable. more honest, more aligned with the actual complexity of what human beings are capable of and not capable of. Something begins to emerge from the accumulated weight of all these internal transformations, something that the empath did not plan, did not pursue, and in many cases did not initially recognize in themselves. They begin to access power they did not know they had, not power in the performative sense, not aggression or dominance or the visible assertion of force. Power in the most precise psychological sense. The capacity to remain fully present, fully functional, and fully themselves in circumstances that would destabilize most people. The capacity to feel everything because the empath's sensitivity never diminishes without being controlled by what they feel. The capacity to see clearly with the sharpened perceptual acuity that repeated hurt has produced without being paralyzed by what they see. The empath, who has been through enough hurt and has done the internal work that hurt demands, rather than numbing, rather than hardening, rather than abandoning their sensitivity to protect themselves from its cost, arrives at a psychological state that is genuinely rare. They are sensitive and resilient simultaneously. They are open and discerning simultaneously. They are warm and boundaried simultaneously. This combination, sensitivity without naivety, warmth without indiscrimination, openness without self-abandonment, is not something that can be manufactured through any other process. It is the specific, irreplaceable product of having been a deep feeler in a world that did not always treat deep feeling with the care it deserved, of having continued to feel deeply anyway, of having refused the easier exits of numbness, bitterness, or the wholesale abandonment of the sensitivity that made the hurt possible in the first place. Machiavelli's dark psychology would identify this as the highest form of strategic development, the cultivation of capability through genuine adversity rather than through comfortable practice. The empath who has been hurt and has not broken is not the same person who existed before the hurt. They are something more complex, more capable, more genuinely formidable, not despite their sensitivity, but because of what that sensitivity, tested and refined by repeated pain, has become. Here is the final truth, the one that all 7 previous segments have been building toward, the one that the people who hurt the empath will never fully understand, and the empath themselves may need to hear clearly before they can fully claim it. The transformation that repeated hurt produces in the empath is not a wound. It is an upgrade, and its completion is not the end of something. It is the beginning of the most powerful chapter of the empath's life. The empath who comes through this process, who has been hurt enough to develop hypervigilance, to begin closing, to acquire terrifying perceptual clarity, to develop the psychological edge of someone who understands pain from the inside, to transform their hope from structural optimism to evidence-based investment, and to access the specific, rare power that all of this produces. That empath is not a diminished version of who they were. They are the completed version, the version that the earlier, more open, more recklessly generous incarnation was always in the process of becoming, even if the process required more pain than anyone should have to endure. The hypervigilance will soften, not disappear. The nervous system does not fully forget what it has learned, but in genuinely safe environments with genuinely trustworthy people. The alarm system will gradually recalibrate towards something less exhausting. The closing will find its balance between the reckless openness of Bifu and the complete closure that would extinguish the empath's gifts entirely. The darkness, the knowledge of pain's mechanics that the empath carries now will become compassion of a different quality, not the compassion of someone who imagines what suffering feels like, the compassion of someone who knows, who carries it in their body, Who can meet another person in their worst moment and be genuinely, specifically, usefully present because they have been in that worst moment themselves and found the way through? And the power, the specific, irreplaceable power of the sensitive person who has been tested and refined and has not broken, will continue to deepen with. Every year, the empath lives in alignment with who they have become rather than who they were before. The people who hurt you did not destroy you. They completed you at an unconscionable cost that they will never fully appreciate. But the completion is real. And what you are now, what you carry, what you see, what you can offer to the people and causes and moments that genuinely deserve you is something that could not have existed without the exact path you walked to get here. This is Mind of the Alpha, where we honor the full, unsparing psychological truth of the human experience with the depth it deserves. If this video describes something you have been living through without having language for it, subscribe right now, because the next part of this series goes even deeper into the empath's psychological journey and what genuine healing and power look like from the inside. Share this with an empath who needs to know that what they are becoming is not damage. It is evolution. Drop a comment below. Tell us where you are in this transformation. You were not broken. You were being built, and the building is not finished yet.